Walla Walla Valley, Washington Territory. October, 1876. The air held the first clean, sharp bite of autumn, a promise of the winter to come. Most men were racing to finish their log cabins, chinking the gaps with mud and moss, stacking cords of cottonwood and pine. Most men were building with wood, but Aurélien Vasseur was building with dirt. He wasn't making sod bricks or adobe. He was erecting heavy plank forms, like a carpenter building a mold for a foundation. And then he was shoveling the valley floor into it. Not the rich topsoil, but the dense clay-heavy subsoil from his well digging. To this he added a small measure of lime, turning it over and over until the mixture was uniform. Then, with his two sons, Luke and Sophie, hauling buckets, he would dump the mixture into the forms and begin tamping. The tool was a heavy length of timber, its end shod with iron. The sound it made was not the sharp crack of a hammer or the rasp of a saw, but a deep, rhythmic, percussive thump, a sound more like a heartbeat than construction. 4 inches of loose earth went in, and with methodical, tireless blows, Aurélien compacted it down to 2. Thump, thump, thump. The sound carried across the yellowing fields, a strange and steady rhythm that drew stares from his neighbors. Thaddeus Crowfoot, a freight teamster whose opinion carried the weight of the massive wagons he drove, pulled his team to a halt on the road. He was a big man, confident in his knowledge of weight, stress, and the unforgiving nature of the frontier. He watched for a long moment, a look of profound disbelief on his face. Silas Cobb, the local sawyer whose entire livelihood depended on the supremacy of wood, stood beside him, shaking his head. "What in God's name is that Frenchman doing?" Cobb muttered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. Crowfoot bellowed across the field. "Vasseur, what is that madness? You're building a house of mud!" Aurélien paused, resting the heavy tamper on the lip of the form. He wiped a line of sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm. He didn't shout back. His voice was calm, measured. "It is not mud, Monsieur Crowfoot. It is terre pisse." "It's dirt," Crowfoot retorted, laughing. "I've hauled freight from St. Louis to the coast. I know what happens to dirt in a spring rain. It turns back to mud. That wall will slump into a pile by May. The first good soaking, and your roof will be sitting on the ground." He gestured with a thick finger. "And what about the frost? It'll wick the groundwater right up and crumble from the inside out. It's a fool's errand." Aurélien Vasseur simply nodded, a small, polite acknowledgement of the man's certainty. "The lime will prevent that," he said, his voice barely carrying. Then he turned back to his work. He lifted the tamper. Thump, thump, thump. The mockery was immediate and widespread. The man building the dirt house became a local joke, a cautionary tale in the making. They called his emerging structure Vasseur's Folly. The children on their way to the schoolhouse would sometimes chant, "The Frenchman built his house of mud. A big rain came and washed it away in a flood." It was foolish, they all agreed. It was crazy. What did this Provençal pisse mason, a man from the sun-drenched fields of southern France, understand about thermal physics that the experienced, hard-bitten builders of the American frontier had missed? I promise you, if you stay with me, you will learn a principle of building science so profound and yet so simple that it can turn a 2-foot-thick wall of simple earth into a passive heating system, a thermal battery that stores the sun's energy and releases it long into the frozen night. This isn't just a story about a strange house. It's a lesson in how ancient wisdom can solve modern problems. Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever seen a rammed earth building? And what did you think of it? And if you find value in these stories of forgotten ingenuity, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel. Aurélien Vasseur was not a carpenter. He was not a logger. Nor was he a farmer in the way his neighbors understood the term. He was a man whose hands understood the language of compression. Back in Provence, in the Rhone Valley, he hadn't worked with pine logs and broadaxes. He had worked with stone, clay, and kiln-fired tiles. His trade was building the massive terre pisé farmhouses that dotted the landscape. Structures designed to endure the fierce, dry cold of the Mistral winds in winter and the baking sun of summer. He knew that the earth beneath his feet, when properly selected and compacted, could become a kind of man-made stone, a slow stone. He had come to America with his wife Marie and their two young children, Luke and Sophie, seeking land and opportunity. They arrived in the Walla Walla Valley with high hopes, but their first winter, in 1875, had nearly broken them. They had built a standard log cabin, just as everyone advised. They had felled the trees, notched the logs, and chinked the gaps as tightly as they knew how. It was a sturdy, respectable structure, indistinguishable from the dozen others in their vicinity, and it was a thermal disaster. That first winter was a lesson in the brutal physics of cold. Aurélien and his family learned that a log wall, no matter how thick, is a poor barrier against sustained, penetrating frost. The cabin consumed firewood at a terrifying rate. He spent most of his days just feeding the cast-iron stove, which glowed red-hot, creating a small circle of habitable space around it. Step more than 6 feet away, and the temperature plummeted. The walls were always cold to the touch. Marie would try to make coffee in the morning, and a skin of ice would form on its surface before she could drink it if she set the cup down on the table too far from the fire. The most unnerving phenomenon was the frost on the nail heads. Every iron nail driven through the logs from the outside acted as a perfect thermal bridge, conducting the killing cold of the exterior directly into the living space. Overnight, these nail heads would grow shimmering domes of frost, little white mushrooms of ice that pushed their way through the interior planking. It was as if the cold itself were growing, invading their home point by point. One morning, Marie went to the corner to get milk from the pail they'd brought in the night before. When she tipped it, nothing poured out. The entire volume of milk was a solid, frozen block that had taken the exact shape of the bucket. When she tapped it with a spoon, it rang with a clear, resonant chime, like a bell. That was the moment Aurélien knew he could not endure another winter like that. His children were always sick, bundled in every layer they owned, sleeping in their coats. His wife's hands were cracked and raw. He was not just failing to thrive, he was failing to protect his family. He looked at the log walls of his cabin not as a shelter, but as an enemy, a sieve that leaked warmth as fast as he could generate it. He knew there had to be a better way, and in his mind, he saw the thick, earthen walls of his homeland, walls that held the memory of the summer sun deep into the autumn, walls that were cool in the afternoon and warm long after midnight. The problem, he understood, wasn't the cold. The cold was a constant. The problem was heat retention. The conventional cabins of the Walla Walla Valley were built on a faulty premise. They were designed to fight the cold with fire, a constant, desperate battle of combustion. A log cabin is essentially a wooden box with a furnace inside. Its R value, the measure of its thermal resistance, is surprisingly low. A typical 8-inch pine log has an R value of about 10. This is better than glass, but it's not enough to stop the steady, relentless drain of heat into a sub-zero environment. The laws of thermodynamics are unforgiving. Heat always moves to cold. In a log cabin during a Washington winter, that movement is a one-way flood outwards. The chinking was another point of catastrophic failure. No matter how carefully applied, the mixture of mud, grass, and moss would shrink and crack as it dried. And as the massive logs settled under their own weight, new gaps would open. This led to drafts. Not just gentle breezes, but jets of Arctic air that knifed through the living space. You could watch a candle flame flicker and bend horizontally, pointing out the precise location of a breach in the wall. Families like the Cobbs and the Blacks spent their winters chasing these drafts, stuffing rags and newspaper into the cracks, a battle they could never truly win. But the biggest failure, the one Aurélien understood from his heritage, was the lack of thermal mass. Wood heats up quickly, and it cools down just as fast. When the fire in the stove died down, the heat stored in the wooden walls dissipated within an hour. The temperature inside the cabin began to track the temperature outside with alarming speed. This meant the fire could never go out. Someone had to stay awake through the night, feeding logs into the stove every 2 hours. To run out of firewood was not an inconvenience. It was a life-threatening emergency. The entire economy of survival was based on the constant, voracious consumption of fuel. Aurélien saw his neighbors caught in this cycle. He saw Thaddeus Crowfoot delivering massive loads of cordwood, a business that boomed every winter. He saw Silas Cobb working his sawmill from dawn until dusk, turning the region's forests into the lumber that built these thermally inefficient shelters. They were all working harder, not smarter. They were treating the symptom, the cold inside the house, instead of the disease, the house's inability to hold on to heat. They were fighting a war of attrition against winter, and winter had infinite reserves. So, in the late summer of 1876, Aurélien Vasseur began to build his solution. He dismantled a portion of his failing log cabin for the roof timbers and interior planks he would need. He chose a spot on his land with good drainage, on a slight rise. First, he laid a foundation of heavy river stone, mortared with lime, raising it a good 18 inches above the ground. This was his answer to Thaddeus Crowfoot's first objection. The stone foundation would act as a capillary break, preventing any groundwater from wicking up into the earthen walls. Then came the forms. He constructed 2 parallel walls of thick planking, held apart by wooden cross ties and secured with removable iron bolts. The gap between the planks was exactly 24 inches. This was his movable mold. He would build the wall in sections or lifts. Once a section of wall was tamped and cured, he could unbolt the forms, move them up, and begin the next layer. The material itself was a science. He taught his family to recognize the right kind of earth, not the dark, organic-rich topsoil, which would decompose and shrink, but the dense, stable subsoil. It had to have the right mix of sand, silt, and, crucially, clay. The clay was the binder. He'd take a handful, moisten it, and roll it into a ball. If it held its shape and didn't crumble, it was good. He piled this earth near the building site, letting it dry in the sun. Then he would pulverize it and mix in about 8% slaked lime by volume. The lime was the magic ingredient, a trick he'd learned from Roman ruins back home. It would react chemically with the clay and moisture, acting as a stabilizer and a binder, making the final wall harder and far more resistant to water. The work was brutally physical, but elegantly simple. A 4-inch layer of the damp, lime soil mixture was shoveled into the forms. Then Aurélien, and sometimes Marie, would step in with the tampers. The goal was to compact that 4-inch layer down to just 2 inches, driving out the air and forcing the particles of earth into an incredibly dense matrix. The sound of the tampers became the soundtrack to their autumn. It was a slow, laborious process. A single section of wall, perhaps 10 feet long and 3 feet high, could take a full day to complete. As the walls rose, their appearance was strange to the valley's eyes. They weren't brown like mud, but a pale, creamy tan. They rose in distinct, layered bands, each one representing a day's work. To his neighbors, it looked like he was pouring a building out of the ground itself. Crowfoot would ride by and shake his head. "It'll never hold the weight of a roof, Vasseur," he'd yell. "The moment you put your rafters on, the whole thing will bulge and collapse. You're building your own tomb." Aurélien would only smile faintly and point to the thickness of the wall. "It is 2 feet thick, monsieur. It will hold. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He simply worked. When the walls reached their full height of 8 feet, he let them cure for 2 weeks in the dry autumn air. They became incredibly hard, almost like a soft sandstone. You could strike them with a hammer, and they would ring. He set the heavy roof timbers directly onto the top of the walls, embedding them into the final layer of tamped earth. The weight settled, and the walls did not bulge. They did not crack. They stood, monolithic and immovable. Finally, he coated the entire exterior and interior with a wash of pure lime and water. The house became a startling, brilliant white, a stark contrast to the dark log cabins around it. The lime wash was not for decoration. It was a protective, breathable skin that would shed rain while allowing any moisture within the wall to evaporate. Marie planted hollyhocks along the base. By the time the first snows came, the Vasseur house looked less like a frontier dwelling and more like something that had been transplanted from a distant, sunnier land. It looked solid, permanent, but the real test was yet to come. To understand why Aurélien Vasseur's house worked, you have to understand a principle that architects now call the thermal flywheel. It's a concept that has almost nothing to do with insulation and everything to do with mass. The problem, as Aurélien knew, was not just stopping heat from leaving, but also storing it in the first place. His entire house was designed around this idea. It was, in effect, a giant slow-release battery for heat. Let's break down the physics. Heat energy, measured in British thermal units, or BTUs, moves in 3 ways. Conduction through direct contact, convection through the movement of air or fluid, and radiation through electromagnetic waves. A log cabin fails on all 3 counts. Cold conducts through the logs. Cold air convects through the gaps. And the warm inner surfaces of the logs quickly radiate their heat away to the colder objects in the room. Aurélien's 24-inch thick rammed earth walls addressed this differently. Their R value, purely as insulation, was only slightly better than a log wall, perhaps R12 or R14. But insulation wasn't their primary job. Their primary job was to be a heat sink. The sheer density of the compacted earth gave it enormous thermal mass. Think of it this way. It takes a huge amount of energy to change the temperature of a dense, heavy object. A lightweight wooden wall can have its temperature changed very quickly. A 2-foot-thick wall of solid earth weighing several tons is incredibly resistant to temperature change. This is the flywheel effect. During the day, even in winter, the sun strikes the south-facing wall of the house. Solar radiation, carrying thousands of BTUs of energy, warms the white lime-washed surface. That heat begins a slow journey, conducting its way into the dense wall. This process is incredibly slow. It takes that wave of heat approximately 10 to 12 hours to travel through the 24 inches of compacted earth. So the peak heat from the afternoon sun, striking the outside of the wall at 2 p.m., doesn't reach the inside surface until 12 hours later, at 2 a.m. Just as the ambient air temperature outside is reaching its absolute coldest point in the dead of night, the heat from the previous day's sun is finally emerging from the interior wall, radiating gentle, steady warmth into the living space. The house was literally releasing yesterday's daylight into the depths of the night. The same principle worked for the heat generated inside. The small wood stove that Aurélien used was not fighting a constant, losing battle against the cold. Instead, its heat was absorbed by the massive walls and the earthen floor. The walls acted as a thermal moderator, a buffer. They soaked up excess heat when the fire was burning brightly, and then slowly released that heat back into the room for hours after the fire had died down to embers. The result was an almost unbelievable temperature stability. Outside, the temperature might swing wildly from a sunny 25 degrees Fahrenheit during the day down to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit at night, a 35-degree difference. Inside Aurelien's house, the temperature would remain almost flat, hovering within a few degrees of 65 degrees Fahrenheit day and night. The walls were smoothing out the brutal peaks and valleys of the daily temperature cycle, creating a gentle, unwavering curve of warmth. He had poured a slow stone that gave back the day long after the day was gone. He wasn't just blocking the cold, he was managing time. That winter, a true test arrived. It came not as a blizzard, but as a silent, suffocating siege of cold. An Arctic high-pressure system settled over the Columbia Plateau, bringing with it a phenomenon the old-timers dreaded, ice fog. For 12 consecutive days, the temperature in the Walla Walla Valley never rose, above minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. A thick, crystalline fog clung to the ground, coating every surface, every tree branch, every fence wire, every blade of dead grass, in a thick layer of feathery rime ice. The sun was a pale, useless disk in the gray sky, its warmth unable to penetrate the frozen mist. For the log cabin settlers, it was a nightmare. The cold was no longer an overnight visitor. It was a permanent resident. The cabins ran cold, no matter how much wood was burned. Ephraim Black, a farmer down the road, had 2 of his children fall ill with pneumonia. His stove, a large and expensive one, roared day and night. Yet the far wall of his cabin was furred with a half-inch of interior frost. The cold was seeping through the wood itself. Silas Cobb, the sawyer, found that the stacks of green lumber in his yard were freezing solid, the moisture inside turning to ice and splitting the boards. He had plenty of wood, but his own house felt like a barn. The valley grew quiet. The normal sounds of frontier life, axes, wagons, distant hammering, ceased. The only sound was the wind and the constant, hungry roar of fires inside homes that were steadily losing the battle. People stayed indoors, huddled, waiting for the cold to break. The strain was immense. Firewood stores that were meant to last until March were being depleted by mid-January. But at the Vasseur house, something strange was happening. Life was continuing as normal. The small wood stove was used, but only for a few hours in the morning to cook and to give the walls their initial thermal charge for the day. For the rest of the day, and all through the night, it was left to die down to coals. The children, Luke and Sophie, were not bundled in coats. They played on the packed earthen floor in their shirt sleeves. Marie could be heard humming as she worked, the sound carrying through the still, frozen air. The domestic warmth inside was proven by a simple, mundane object. Marie, a woman of Provence, could not cook without olive oil. They had brought several large tins with them from France. During their first winter in the log cabin, the oil had been a constant frustration. Below 45 degrees Fahrenheit, it would solidify into a thick, waxy, yellow plug. To use it, she had to place the tin near the stove for an hour until a small portion melted. In every other house in the valley during the Arctic outbreak, olive oil was as hard as a tallow candle. A knife couldn't cut it. But in the Vasseur kitchen, the tin sat on a shelf away from the stove. When Marie tipped it to pour some into her skillet, the oil flowed out in a stream of clear, viscous gold. That freely pouring olive oil was the ultimate proof. It was a liquid testament to a home where the temperature never dipped into the zone of misery. The house wasn't just surviving the cold, it was ignoring it. The vindication came on the 10th day of the freeze. Thaddeus Crowfoot was running a freight errand, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his beard crusted with ice. The brutal cold was wreaking havoc on his equipment. Metal became brittle. As he passed Aurélien Vasseur's property, there was a sharp crack like a rifle shot. His massive wagon lurched violently to one side. The iron hub on the right front wheel had fractured, splitting clear in two. Crowfoot let out a string of curses that steamed in the air. He was stranded. The blacksmith's shop was a half-mile away, but he couldn't leave his wagon and team. He unhitched the horses, blanketing them against the killing cold. Furious, frustrated, and shivering despite his heavy coat, he stomped over to Vasseur's gate. It was closer than his own home. He carried the heavy, broken piece of iron, intending to ask if Vasseur could watch his wagon while he walked to the smithy. As he waited for someone to answer his call, he leaned his back against the corner of the strange white house. He shifted his weight, and his bare hand, chapped and numb with cold, rested flat against the lime-washed wall. He had expected to feel a coldness so profound it would be like touching a block of river ice. Every stone, tree, and wooden wall in the valley was a source of biting, finger-numbing cold. He expected the wall to steal what little warmth his hand had left. Instead, a slow, steady, unmistakable warmth bloomed against his palm. It was not hot, like a stove. It was a gentle, living warmth. He jerked his hand away in disbelief, then pressed it back against the wall. He spread his fingers, maximizing the contact. The wall was warm as the flank of a healthy horse. He stared at his hand, then at the wall, his mind struggling to reconcile the sensation with a decade of frontier experience. This was impossible. A wall of dirt, standing in -18 degrees Fahrenheit air, should not feel like this. It should be a monument of frost. The door opened, and Aurélien Vasseur stood there, holding not a lantern, but a simple candle, its flame utterly still, not a flicker of a draft in the doorway. He saw Crowfoot, saw the broken hub in his other hand, and the look of sheer, unadulterated shock on the teamster's face. Crowfoot was speechless for a moment. He looked from Vasseur's calm expression to the wall his hand was still pressed against. The anger had drained out of him, replaced by a deep and unsettling awe. He finally found his voice, but it was quiet, stripped of its usual bluster. He didn't apologize for his mockery. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He stated a new truth, a fact his own senses had just delivered to him. "Vasseur," he said, his voice raspy, "you didn't build a wall." He paused, searching for the right words, for a metaphor that could contain the impossibility of what he was feeling. "You built a low sun for the winter." Aurélien simply smiled. "Would you like to come in and get warm, Monsieur Crowfoot? Marie has coffee on." The story of Thaddeus Crowfoot's hand on the warm wall spread through the valley almost as fast as the cold had. It was a tangible story, a sensory detail that people could understand. It wasn't about theory, it was about a feeling. After the cold snap broke, a slow procession of neighbors began visiting the Vasseur house, not to mock, but to learn. They would come on the pretense of borrowing a tool or sharing news, but their real purpose was to discreetly touch the walls. They'd run a hand over the interior surface and marvel at the absence of chill. They saw the healthy children, the single small pile of firewood, the freely pouring olive oil. They saw a family living in a state of impossible comfort. Aurélien, true to his quiet nature, never gloated. He answered every question with simple, practical explanations. He showed them the tamping tool. He explained the mix of clay and lime. He let them feel the density of the cured wall. He treated their curiosity with the same calm patience with which he had treated their ridicule. He was not a preacher. He was a craftsman sharing his craft. The real turning point came at the Walla Walla Harvest Fair in the autumn of 1877. Aurélien didn't enter a prize pumpkin or a prize sow. At the urging of Thaddeus Crowfoot, who had become his most vocal and passionate advocate, he entered a demonstration. He built a 6-foot-long, 4-foot-high section of pisse wall right there on the fairgrounds. He erected the wooden forms, piled the subsoil beside it, and began to work. At first, people watched from a distance, but Crowfoot, using his booming teamster's voice, drew them in. "Come on now, don't be shy. You think it's mud? Come feel it." This is the wall that beat the ice fog. He invited men to pick up the tampers. Silas Cobb, the sawyer, was one of the first. He hesitantly took the heavy tool and began to pound the earth in the forms. He felt the loose soil compress, becoming solid and unyielding under his own force. He felt the physics of it in his arms and shoulders. Farmer after farmer took a turn, their skepticism melting away with every rhythmic thump. They weren't just watching, they were participating. They were learning the technique through their own labor. Aurélien had turned his harshest critics into his students. By the end of the fair, at least a dozen farmers had taken measurements of his forms and made arrangements to buy lime. The knowledge began to spread, not through a book or a government pamphlet, but from one farmer's hands to another's. The technique never fully replaced log construction, but variations of it began to appear across the region. People built pisse root cellars, barns, and smokehouses. A few hardy souls built their entire homes this way. They discovered that the houses were not only warmer in winter, but also dramatically cooler in summer, the thermal flywheel working in reverse to absorb the day's heat and keep the interiors comfortable. The fuel savings were immense, with families reporting they used 60 to 70% less firewood. Aurélien Vasseur's folly had become the new frontier wisdom. It's a strange quirk of history that the principles Aurélien Vasseur knew in his bones are now considered cutting-edge green building science. Modern architects and engineers speak of thermal mass, passive solar design, and phase change materials. They use complex software to model the way heat moves through a building over a 24-hour cycle. Yet what they are modeling is the very same phenomenon that this Provençal mason understood a century and a half ago. He didn't have computer models. He had a tradition passed down through generations, a physical intuition for how the earth breathes, absorbing and releasing energy on a geological timescale. His rammed earth wall was a humble, low-tech ancestor of the most advanced, sustainable designs of today. In the end, the story of Aurélien Vasseur isn't just about a house. It's about a different way of seeing the world. His neighbors saw the earth as dirt, something to be scraped away to make room for a proper wooden foundation. They saw winter as an enemy to be fought with the brute force of fire. Aurélien saw the earth as a vessel, a battery capable of holding the energy of the sun. He saw winter not as an enemy to be battled, but as a condition to be managed with intelligence and grace. He didn't build a fortress against the cold. He built a reservoir for warmth. He poured a slow stone that gave back the day long after the day was gone, a quiet lesson in resilience, patience, and the profound wisdom hidden in the ground beneath our feet. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you believe that these old ways have something to teach us, please like this video and subscribe for more tales of forgotten ingenuity, and let us know in the comments, what modern problem do you think could be solved with a bit of old-world wisdom? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.